Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Roderick Flood, the Provost of Gresham College, and I'm delighted, as always, to welcome you to a Gresham lecture, and particularly to welcome you this evening to the Peter Naylor lecture organised by the Gresham Society, which I would be delighted if all of you would join. They have an interesting programme of activities, and this and in general support the college most effectively. This lecture marks, or is in memory of one of my predecessors, Peter Naylor, distinguished historian, and it's therefore particularly appropriate that this evening we have another distinguished historian, the Lord Hennessy of Nymphsfield, better known to all of us as Peter Hennessy. Peter is and has been since 1992 Professor of Contemporary British History at Queen Mary College in the University of London. Before that he was a journalist, or simultaneously has been a journalist, a presenter of radio, TV programmes, and from 1994 to 1997 Professor of Rhetoric at Gresham College. Peter, as I'm sure you're going to hear in a few minutes, exemplifies the arts of rhetoric, the arts of persuasion, the arts of analysis, and the arts of public speaking. I think all of us have greatly enjoyed his lectures, both to Gresham and elsewhere, and therefore it's a great pleasure again to ask Peter to speak, and he's going to talk to us on the cold rules for national security, history, and the defence of the realm. Peter.
Peter was a great servant of all the institutions to which he belonged. The Mercer School, Wadham College, Oxford, the Civil Service, Gresham College. He also served the Royal Navy with great distinction as an administrator in the Polaris Executive during its pioneering days as the British nuclear deterrent, and as a professor at the Royal Naval College, Greenwich, which is where I first met him in the late 1970s. Peter, I knew from reputation, was a natural teacher. He turned out to be a natural broadcaster too, in a documentary I made with Caroline Anstey for BBC Radio 4 in 1988 on the British nuclear weapons programme. Peter, quite simply, was a star in that broadcast, explaining the complexities and vicissitudes of the British bomb with a passion matched only by his lightness of touch, and all delivered in that beautiful, beautiful voice. To be a friend of Peter Naylor's was to be very lucky. He had a gift for friendship and generated a tonic effect on every occasion one met him. He was a lovely man. This evening I'm treading on classic Naylor terrain. I hope Peter would have approved, even though our views may diverge a bit on one or two particles of the path we've trodden and as our country still seeks to tread, as there's a rather special influence in the wider world. Ladies and gentlemen, I must declare an interest too. I'm a member of the Chief of the Defence Staff Strategic Advisory Panel, but my thoughts and views this evening are entirely my own. Let me begin with a quotation. The British and the French are the only countries in the European Union with the instinct to intervene. We are always looking for different playing fields. At the gathering in the Travellers' Club in Pall Mall last June, during which Douglas Hurd, who served a long tenure as Foreign Secretary under Margaret Thatcher and John Major, 1989 to 95, made that observation, he also noted that at international meetings, people are not bored by what the British have to say, they are interested. A few weeks earlier, I'd heard a highly distinguished former United States Secretary of State say he emphatically didn't want the United Kingdom to cease being a nuclear weapons power in the near future, as the United States would always wish Britain, and these are his exact words, to be part of the conversation when the world discussed disarmament, and without a weapon, the UK would not be there. 3 months later, the Foreign and Commonwealth Secretary, William Hague, summoned a mixture of parliamentarians, journalists, scholars and old diplomatic hands to the huge and exquisite Grand Locarno room in the Foreign and Commonwealth Office for what the invitation described as a major address on the role of the Foreign Office, and this was on the 8th of September this year. The line which set the tone for the whole of the Foreign Secretary's speech was that the nation that is purely reactive in foreign policy is in decline. There it was, undiluted and caveat-free, the special impulse, the authentic voice of a country quite unprepared for mediocrity in the shape of foreign policy quiescence. Mr. Haig's predecessors, Lord Curzon, Austin Chamberlain, Ernest Bevin, Anthony Eden, the great ghosts whose shades one can still sense in that dazzling palazzo of a building designed by Sir Gilbert Scott and opened by Benjamin Disraeli in 1868, all of them would have approved of his words. Indeed, they would have thought that he could think and speak no other. As for Mr. Haig's boss, David Cameron, the words he used a few weeks later at the Conservative Party conference in Manchester would have left those old ancestors glowing with posthumous pride. Britain, the Prime Minister declared, Britain never had the biggest population, the largest landmass, the richest resources, but we had the spirit. Let's turn this time of challenge into a time of opportunity. Not sitting around watching things happen and wondering why, but standing up, making things happen and asking why not. What a busy bee the Prime Minister is. Aspirational disarmament, I think, is the problem. Aspirational disarmament, generally, has never been a simple business for Britain during its long slippage from pre-1914 superpowerdom. And so, on present trends, listening to those voices, it is unlikely to become so. The instinct to intervene is a particularly difficult and important frenzy for contemporary historians to distill. That's a Keynes phrase. Do you remember at the end of the general theory? Madmen in authority, hearing voices in the air, are distilling their frenzy from the words of some defunct economist a few years earlier. Nothing changes. But this particular frenzy is an interesting one to distill. It was very evident during a spring this year evening on strategy at the Royal College of Defence Studies, which, naturally, given where we were and who we were, had a particular interest in Britain's place in the world, its continuing desire to cut a dash in international affairs, and the mismatch between that impulse and the stretched, though ultimately successful, resources available to sustain it. Libya was vivid in our minds, as was Afghanistan. The previous autumn's Strategic and Defence and Security Review also, and Iraq still hung heavy over the room. One senior participant, Vice Admiral Charles Stile, the RCDS's commandant, observed that he'd been in the naval service for 37 years, and that for all of them, apart from a short post-Falklands boost, he and his colleagues had been managing decline. In the end, he said, it begins to screw up your mind. Another participant wondered if in these days of freedom of information, a truly no-holds-barred review exercise could summon up the required levels of realism and candour in Whitehall. I recalled that evening the absurd line given the defence cuts in the Strategic Defence and Security Review that accompanied it in the October 2010 National Security Strategy, which was entitled A Strong Britain in an Age of Uncertainty. It declared in its introduction that the National Security Council, this is the Prime Minister's great invention, which indeed is working very well, the National Security Council has reached a clear conclusion that Britain's national interests require us to reject any notion of the shrinkage of our influence. There we are. Just like that, Tommy Cooper-style assertion. No shrinkage of our influence. And the very next day, huge cuts to the armed forces. Another participant that evening at the Royal College of Defence Studies suggested that the impulse to react, as David Cameron had done as Prime Minister when Benghazi was about to fall to Gaddafi's forces, was hardwired into him and perhaps the country he led. Thinking about it the following weekend after that seminar, it reminded me of a comparable appetite a century ago captured in the words of Lord Rosebery, Liberal Prime Minister, 1894-95, distinguishing in 1899 between what he called sane imperialism, as distinguished from what I, or Rosebery, might call, in fact Rosebery did call it, wildcat imperialism. Though I do think he went a bit far, Rosebery, a year later in his rectoral address at Glasgow University, when he said of the British Empire, no one outside an asylum wishes to be rid of it. Replace in the 1899 quote the word imperialism with the words liberal and humanitarian intervention, and you find, I think, the comparator and the impulse behind that hubristic and self-delusory sentence in the 2010 National Security Review, itself a classic example of what a friend of mine, a former officer of the Secret Intelligence Service, called the itch after the amputation. I'm sure there is much in that, but in some of its aspects it's almost a divine and laudable itch, a divine discontent. Why? Because one can define patriotism, as I do in my own case, for example, as a desire for one's country to be greater than the sum of its parts. And this wish applies to a wide range of the activities contained within our islands, including punching in the world's scholarly and intellectual markets heavier than the weight of our accumulated little grey cells, i.e. the universities, my trade. This variety of patriotism, in my judgment, is also part of the impulse to provide a strategy for the UK which increases the chances of this where diplomacy, intelligence, defence policy and weapons procurement, trade, aid and the instruments of soft power such as the BBC World Service and the British Council mingle and fuse. For these reasons, I am a supporter of the practice of publishing regular national security strategies and defence and security reviews. And the Coalition have undertaken to do this once every 5 years now. Do them together. Furthermore, one must not be too unkind about the current set of ministers dealing with Britain's place in the world. It's hard for a country that was a great power for such a time as ours to alter a nervous system long in the making. As the great Charles de Gaulle wrote a few years before he became the first president of the French Fifth Republic in the late 1950s, France is not really herself unless she is in the front rank. A British version of this kind of Gaullism plays powerfully still in the United Kingdom. The appetite for being a territorial imperial power has long abated, but when it comes to being a great power or a pocket superpower, as that shrewd observer of we Brits, Stryker Maguire, formerly Newsweek's man in London, liked to put it, the fires are not entirely banked. Nor should they be. For as Jeremy Greenstock, former ambassador to the United Nations and later director of the Ditchley Foundation, put it in a lecture to the Order of St Michael and George, that's the diplomatic and intelligence section of the honours system this year. Just think what a rough crowd they must have been to lecture to. But anyway, Jeremy talking to the Order of St Michael and George this June, this is what he said. It is probably inevitable that we shall continue to lose relative power as others grow, but there is still a lot to play for. So there is, especially if we take the non-heroic, unflashy approach to the diplomatic influence as prescribed by that arch-realist in the Foreign Office in Number 10, the great Marquess of Salisbury, in the late 19th century, in terms of this is what he talked about, a series of microscopic advantages, a judicious suggestion here, an opportune civility there, a wise concession at one moment, and a far-sighted persistence at another. That's the perfect definition of diplomacy, I think. That said, the Strategic Defence and Security Review of last year, October 2010, was, in my view, the least satisfactory of the 11 defence reviews that have now been conducted since the end of the Second World War. And I'll do a brief reprise of them. Number one, the Harwood Review, 1949, under a Labour government. This was neither announced nor published. Those were the days. And it didn't emerge until 1980 at the National Archives under the 30-year rule. And I discovered a file on the fate of the Royal Marine bands. So I sent for it. And it was a memo from the Admiralty to the Harwood Review saying you cannot abolish the Marines and put them into the army because they provide the bands for the entire naval service. It's out of the question. And I thought, what's this? Harwood Review. It turns out to have been the first big defence review since the war, and we knew nothing of it. It had not leaked. It was an attempt to keep the defence estimates at an average of £700 million a year over the 3 years 1950 to 52. And it was swiftly swept away by the Korean War-inspired rearmament, which in fact quadrupled the defence estimates. The second one was the Chiefs of Staff report on defence policy and global strategy, 1952, under a Conservative government. which was not published either, the chief stressed the overwhelming primacy of the Cold War threat. Quotes, "The free world is menaced everywhere by the implacable and unlimited aims of Soviet Russia." Close quote. It foresaw, quotes, "a prolonged period of Cold War and urged that the priority of the UK should be 1. Action required to win the Cold War, 2. Playing our part in deterrence, plural, against war, 3. Preparations for war." This too eventually emerged in the National Archives at Kew. The first one that you may remember, because it was published, is the Sands Review, Duncan Sands, Conservative Defence Minister in 1957, which foreshadowed the end of national service, substantial cuts in conventional forces, and a reliance upon nuclear deterrence as the country moved from the age of atomic bombs to the immensely more powerful thermonuclear weapons. The fourth of them was Dennis Healey Mark I, 64-66, Labour government, which is primarily remembered for the cancellation of the TSR-2, the Tactical Strike and Reconnaissance Aircraft, which was going to replace the V-bombers, and the planned alternative purchase of United States-made F-111s. The fifth review is Healey Mark II, 1968, Labour of course, following the sterling devaluation of November 1967. Harold Wilson, the Prime Minister, announced a planned withdrawal of British forces from east of Suez and the cancellation of the F-111 order. The sixth defence review since the war was the Mason Review, Roy Mason, Labour Defence Secretary, 74-75. Under this, the United Kingdom defence effort was to concentrate on NATO's central front in Germany, anti-submarine warfare in the Eastern Atlantic, home defence and the nuclear deterrent, with reductions in out-of-NATO area deployments, RAF transports and amphibious capability. Number 7 was the John Knott Review, 1981, Conservative, drastic reductions in the Royal Navy's surface fleet, including the loss of an aircraft carrier and 2 amphibious ships, while replacing Polaris with Trident as the carrier of the UK nuclear deterrent. Drastically revised on the naval side as a result of the Falklands War of April-June 1982. Indeed, it's hard to believe, but I was having lunch in June 1981 with a friend of mine in MOD on the naval side, and already it had leaked what was going to happen to the surface fleet, and he was very gloomy. And I said to him, "What can be done?" He said, "Nothing. The only thing that can save the surface fleet now is a small colonial war a long way away requiring a lot of ships." Exact words, I wrote them down. And in April 1982, I rang him up. "X," I said, "I think you've gone too far." The next one, number 8, is Options for Change 1990, Conservative, post-Cold War rethink, reduced the size of the army by 1/3, announced the withdrawal of 6 RAF squadrons from Germany and the slimming of the Royal Navy's destroyer frigate fleet from 48 to 40. Number 9, the Defence Cost Study 1994, Conservative, use of outsourcing, the civilianisation of previously military functions and the private finance initiative to shed 18,700 military and civilian jobs by the year 2000 and to put, as they put it, frontline first. Number 10, the Strategic Defence Review of 1998, Labour, plus the Strategic Defence Review new chapter of 2002, Labour, after the atrocities of 9/11. This involved restructuring the army, increase in joint capability with a tri-service approach, greater use of new technology. It spelt out the number of overseas operations that the UK could conduct at any one time, with or without allies, and the new chapter revised it in the light of the huge international terrorist threat. All of these reviews, ladies and gentlemen, had a strong element of cost push behind them and a desire to reduce the proportion of gross domestic product absorbed by defence. Aspirations were perpetually outstripping resources. But the October 2010 Coalition Defence Review was rushed. It looked and smelt like a fistful of spending reviews overlain by a thin patina of strategy. It cried out for rethinking and revision from the moment it was published, a view expressed actually in August this year by the House of Commons Defence Select Committee in its report on the Strategic Defence and Security Review of the National Security Strategy. The force requirements of the Libyan operation 5 months later made this plain for all to see, and talk soon began of its being reopened as the difficulties of what one insider called, during the early days of the Libyan operation, a slow war of attrition by inches became apparent. In fact, the most accomplished review of the post-war years lay beyond the standard defence review genre, which is why it doesn't feature in my list of 11. And it fell into a class of its own. It was called the Future Policy Study, and it was commissioned in great secrecy by Harold Macmillan in June 1959 and tasked with a candid assessment of where the UK would be in the world by 1970 on current policies. It's a fascinating side of Macmillan. In October 59, he won the smuggest of all general election campaigns in my lifetime, the famous "You've Never Had It So Good" on peace and prosperity. But in private, he was deeply anxious and had a great sense of reality and wanted his ministers' noses rubbed in that reality, and this review was meant to do it. And in fact, this review, which of course wasn't declassified until 31 years afterwards, remains the model of how to handle the place in the world question for we Brits, because it's the only post-1945 example of an all-in approach that covered the range of moving parts and their relationship one to another in terms of Britain's security, well-being, and capacity to influence others, including all the economic and industrial aspects. If I were Chief Historical Advisor to the Prime Minister, a yet-to-be-created post to which I do not aspire, and not merely because I'm an independent crossbench peer, not a party one, I would urge David Cameron to commission a no-holds-barred equivalent of Harold Macmillan's Future Policy Study, with instructions that it be suffused with the purpose of drawing up the cold rules for national safety, which the great historians of empire, Robinson and Gallagher, in their classic work Africa and the Victorians, said each political generation had to compile for itself. This cannot be done, in my judgment, without a stiff dose of what the American scholars Dick Neustadt and Ernie May called thinking in time and seeing time as a stream, by carrying with you into your horizon scanning and future strategy endeavours a living sense of those who trod the same path as you along that long road of reviews since Victory in Europe Day in May 1945. It should open by making the case for the UK as a serious player in world affairs, which is no longer an of-course proposition, and by a burst of candour about what this means in share of gross domestic product terms. Its prose should provide an equally vivid portrait of what a less globally ambitious UK would look like in terms of armed forces, equipment, defence spending, and intelligence capability. Now, such a review, I think, ladies and gentlemen, unless a seriously shrivelled Britain was to be the outcome, would also require a genuine infusion of grand strategy, which is not the same as generating stratagems, to draw a distinction the defence analyst Robert Fox, who I hope's here somewhere, likes to make. This indispensable function, as the House of Commons Public Administration Committee noticed in the autumn of 2010 in its Who Does UK National Strategy investigation, is effectively balkanised, not just across Whitehall, but to an outsider's eye, even within critical departments like the Ministry of Defence. If the great Clausewitz could somehow manifest himself in London today, he would have a difficult time finding out who was in charge of grand strategy. Although the word strategy itself is ubiquitous and almost as devalued a piece of linguistic litter as the word vision, both now utterly meaningless in Whitehall because of overextended use. Of visiting Clausewitz, was he capable of retrospectively penetrating those committee rooms, intelligence sections, and chiefs of staff suites where our 10 post-war, or 11 post-war defence and security reviews have been crafted? Would, I think, see successive generations of our guardians of national security in pursuit of two related holy grails. The first one is this: the careful management and, where possible, disguise of decline by keeping as many capabilities as possible in being, or failing that, sustaining a capacity to regenerate them. Secondly, the sculpting from the assets, human, physical and structural, in the armed forces, the civil service, the diplomatic service and the intelligence agencies, a system whereby the maximum value can be squeezed out of them. This has been the impulse behind a parallel, though rarely synchronised, series of organisational reports alongside those defence reviews. They include the 1958 review of the Chiefs of Staff's functions, the Ismay-Jacob report on the Higher Direction of Defence 1963, which led to the creation of a unified Ministry of Defence the following year, the 1984 changes to the Chief of the Defence Staff's role and the abolition of the 3 service departments, the 2011 Levine report on defence reform, the Trend Greenhill reports on the reforms of the Joint Intelligence Committee in 1968, which created the assessment staff in the Cabinet Office, which flourishes to this day, and a pair of reviews of the Foreign Office by Lord Plowden in 1964 and Sir Val Duncan in 1969, as well as the famous 1977 Central Policy Review Staff's Review of Overseas Representation, which so irritated the diplomatic service. There will, I suspect, be a fistful of similar inquiries to come before I find myself in some great celestial archive where no one is ever denied access to any file, which is my definition of heaven, as you would understand, being one of nature's 22-carat nerds. If asked, can history be any help to the next set of strategic inquisitors, I would answer possibly, probably even. If asked in what way, I would reply that first of all is the assumption that our pocket superpower impulse is likely to continue unabated to the point where we reconcile ourselves to being a medium-sized power with no particular wish to exert ourselves in terms of reach, capability and expense than any other country tucked up inside a big regional grouping, European Union, and part of a long-standing military alliance, NATO. If the answer was no, that we didn't want to carry on being a pocket superpower, I would be seriously surprised, and I must admit not a little regretful. I would then say post-war history has little with which to help, because we're now dealing with a government mentalité that I don't recognise and have never experienced. If the answer was yes, but a slimmer, better organised and targeted version of the status quo was what was wanted, I would not be surprised. The first thing I would say is that as a country, we should not continue as if in terms of in place in the world, we were operating on the old principle of the Venetian proverb, directed to the fluid precariousness of their city amidst the lagoon. Sempre crolla ma non cade. It is always collapsing, but it never falls down. We are very Venetian as a country in that way. Even more so on Thursday tomorrow, I fear, but that's another question. How can matters be so organised in future that we avoid the perils of overstretch and the depressing, often searing, recitative of relative decline? First would come the history in the form of an examination of the ingredients that have competed for time, attention, money and capability, both human and physical, since 1945. First of all, the permanent demands or musts. Air defence of the United Kingdom, home defence of the United Kingdom, nuclear deterrent, security of the Eastern Atlantic, NATO commitments. They have been the musts of my lifetime, for all governments. Secondly, for the years 1945 to 80, the military requirements of disposing of the British Empire, with some residuals still exerting demands, e.g. the Falkland Islands and Gibraltar. Thirdly, the periodic need to bring military aid to the civil ministries, as it's called in the jargon, such as Green Goddess fire engines during industrial action by the Fire Brigades Union, or military aid to the civil power, which is what we did in Northern Ireland for so long. Fourthly, unexpected crises that cannot be met with inaction. Northern Ireland in '69, the Argentinian invasion of the Falkland Islands in 1982. Cannot be met with inaction, that is, without either dereliction of duty, harm to national self-image and international image of the UK, or both. Fifthly, crises that can be met with inaction, but at a price in terms of the factors listed above. Libya could have been an example of this in 2011, but turned out, I'm glad to say, not to be. The sixth element is what I call the wouldn't it be nice to help if we had the money questions. If we had the money, the people and the kit. And the list of these is nearly endless because of what Douglas Hurd called the instinct to intervene. Seventhly, the sustenance of top-flight diplomatic and intelligence services, a considerable overseas aid programme and a substantial investment in soft power, by which I mean the overseas service of the BBC and the British Council. There are others, but they're the two main ones. So, ladies and gentlemen, in the light of the recent post-1945 past, the test for strategy making, I think, is twofold. One, how can its formation be best organised to reconcile or decide between the vectors of forces created by those list of functions I just gave, 1 to 7? Secondly, how can it help run a system that sustains a capacity to act, in the words of the 1998 Strategic Defence Review, that is greater than the sum of its parts? The capacity to act impulse became especially acute in the aftermath of the 2010 Defence and Security Review, as, in Sir Kevin Tebbutt's words, we had a Strategic Defence and Security Review which says we want to continue to do high-intensity things a long way from our shores, but with less. This puts great strain on both our armed forces and on industry. You can't turn capabilities on and off like a tap. You can lose them. One's fed up with managing decline, but managing without sufficient resources, said Sir Kevin, who's a former permanent secretary at the Ministry of Defence and now a leading figure in UK-based defence industry. We've never, ladies and gentlemen, as a country in my lifetime, pulled off this pair of requirements, and I think it's high time that we did. As William Hague said in his Grand Locarno Room speech in September, the world is not conducting a seminar on foreign policy. Out there are nations advancing their own national interest, ideas which promote violent extremism, wars we must prevent, new threats we must anticipate. And if we are, ladies and gentlemen, to seriously crank up our chances of doing so, history, contemporary history especially, will be one of the key levers of that cranking up. At the very least, it will remind the future guardians of our national security, during what will inevitably be the very dark hours of the next Strategic Defence and Security Review, that we have been here before and that they are not alone. That the ghosts of many of the best Whitehall, the armed forces and the intelligence services ever reared will be flitting through their committee rooms, emitting sympathetic but inaudible sounds, with more than a touch of irony upon their countenances, as the latest manifestation of our enduring great power impulse bumps and grinds alongside our always limited capacity to fund it. Finally, let me make with you, I hope, in discussion, a quantum leap of the imagination to a future Prime Minister and Cabinet who collectively decide that the instinct to intervene has to stop, and charges its National Security Council officials, the Foreign and Commonwealth Office, the Ministry of Defence and the secret agencies to concentrate on home defence or making the UK a hard target against people, states, factors and actions that could seriously harm the country. What would such a threat assessment, external and internal, look like? Hence the handout for you, which I don't mean to depress you. I think you shouldn't read it now, but sit down at home with a stiff drink and then read it. But with the help of my friend Alan Petty and some necessarily anonymous Whitehall insiders who've long experience with national security matters, I have attempted such an audit on that bit of paper. This circle of anxieties and possibilities, which we can talk about in a minute if you like, may strike you as a vastly overdone thing, even verging on the chill your bones fictional oeuvre begun with such effect 106 years ago by William Le Queux, the John le Carré of his day, in the 1906 bestseller The Invasion of 1910, in which the Kaiser's armies are successfully put ashore in Norfolk, while England dozed through the small hours of a late summer Saturday night and Sunday morning on the 1st and 2nd of September 1910. It's a terrific read. There's one problem with it. It was serialised and commissioned by the Daily Mail, so the Germans' invasion route goes through every town where their circulation needed boosting, which rather detracts from its verisimilitude. But you can't have everything. As my friend Alan Petty pointed out, as we compiled our two-edged circle on a warm August lunchtime in the House of Lords, it reminded him of Philip Larkin's poem Aubade, in which the gloomy sage of Hull writes about waking up at 4 in the morning with too much wine in him and thinking about where and when he'll die. He was a cheerful soul, wasn't he? Quotes, the anaesthetic from which none come round. There you are, that's to cheer you up. The Larkin line caught on Alan's memory was that, unlike our deaths, he also says, in the poem, most things may never happen. And the greatest threat of my lifetime, our lifetime, the Cold War mutating into World War III was avoided. But the point about the cartography of threats I've given you, this exercise, the point of this exercise is that some of them might, and in particularly malign and simultaneous combination. If you accept that, two things stand out. One, even with the instinct to intervene curbed, the world and its woes won't ignore these shores, nor is domestic security guaranteed. Secondly, finding ways to avert such threats and or the resilience to withstand them if they happen is a costly business, requiring a serious slice of gross domestic product, even if we found ways of keeping the defence spending proportion below 2%, which is too low in my view, given current commitments and aspirations, seriously too low. If I was a William Le Queux-style thriller writer, I'd have a crack at all this in novel form. I'm not, so I won't. This, at least, you have been spared. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much indeed. They have tremendous spread and range, and this sheer fascination of digging away in the National Records Centre and finding things that probably nobody even remembered was there. So that really is the most exciting thing of all. We do have time for questions. This is being broadcast, so would you please make sure first you catch my eye and that the microphone with Sophie gets to you before you ask your question.
Good evening, Professor Hennessy. It's always an immense pleasure to hear you speak on a variety of exceedingly important topics.
Thank you.
Within the ring here, which presumably applies to internal threats,
Yep.
I see near the top on the left, social unrest and riots.
Yes.
What do you think of the present situation and the situation in the near future of possibly millions of young people leaving our state school system unable to read, write or add up, unable to find manufacturing jobs, unable to earn a living? Do you think that is a threat to social unrest? And what do you think should be done about it?
Well, I wrote that bit before the riots, actually. It won't be millions leaving in quite such a dire condition. One mustn't overdo it. And state schools do things well. They didn't do well in my time as a state school boy. They've also lost one or two things that we did well in my state school that they don't do so well these days. They're not so good at spelling, and their syntax leaves a good deal to be desired. Even the very best and brightest of them ain't too good at that, says Hennessy, lapsing into Cockney slang. There is always going to be a problem with small numbers in concentrated areas who've opted out pretty well right through the school system and who've got family problems as well. The statistics that were compiled from the court records that were published this week, the education element is very prominent in that, and you're quite right to stress that. But we've got to keep at it. The one thing an open society like ours simply cannot do and should not do is despair. And there's a divine spark of intellectual curiosity in everybody. There's not one person I've ever taught or met that is without intellectual curiosity, the divine spark. It's just a question of lighting it. Some people light up at different times in their lives, they sputter out, come back again. But there's a whole range of interlocking social problems. But the education thing, I think you certainly are right to concentrate on, because if that is failing in certain areas, significant numbers of people, it's in deep, deep trouble. But the one problem we have as Brits, I'm devoted to this country, as I hope was apparent from what I said, is we have this malign capacity to inject our education debates with social status obsessions. The absurd obsession with what kind of school you went to, what kind of background. Conservative Party isn't completely free of that either. Do you remember when Douglas Hurd, for whom I've got enormous respect, ran for the Conservative leadership in 1990? It was held against him that his father was a landowner and he'd been to Eton. In his own party. It was only an election within the Conservative Party. If there's a possibility of injecting the status obsession into any of our activities, but education above all, we Brits can't resist. And if I had a magic wand, that's what I'd wave it over. And I've always felt that. But thank you for your question. It's nice to see you again.
In an era of ever-shrinking military budgets, does it still make sense to keep the nuclear deterrent, or is there a tipping point when the value in terms of prestige and power is overtaken by the cost in terms of money?
or why every Prime Minister so far hasn't given it up, is not so much prestige and power, although it is very much part of that. It's the possibility of a rerun in dreadful circumstances of the 1940 picture, which is very much in us, when a small amount of highly advanced equipment, operated by a small number of very highly trained young men, was all that stood between us in 1940 and ceasing to be a recognisable country in 1941. And that's very much in us. And that's why no Prime Minister, whatever the cost so far, and the upgrades of it, or getting into the business in the first place, have always coincided with a huge economic crisis, if you look at it. Every time. It's the last thing they'll give up, just in case. In case it happens, and in case history, what's left of it, after a nuclear attack, judges them to be the one who gave it away. It's not rational, but that's why they do it. And I think they will continue to do so. And I think they're right. And if you look at this threat diagram, there's a fairly powerful argument for a bomb of some kind in there, isn't there? I think, but not everybody agrees with that. We've always been split on that as a nation. And every time the question of the bomb goes on heat, which it is at the moment, we quite rightly have a pretty profound debate about it.
In your reference to education, I think the tragedy is there'll be thousands upon thousands of youngsters who'll be well educated who will not get jobs.
Exactly.
Because the jobs just won't be there for them to have. Looking at your circle, and it's a cheering read, I must say, one can't help feeling, well, how relevant is military strength to most of the dangers that you list? Things that may not be likely to happen. Well, when you look at the list, a lot of them seem all too likely to happen. If you're running a book on this, I should think serious collapse of the UK, EU, world economy would be number one at the moment, as you implied in one of your side remarks. And then severe climatic events overseas with repercussions. We've seen an aspect of that in recent events that have affected economies very severely, and they're taking a long time to recover. Serious nuclear accident is certainly well within the bounds of possibility. The terrorist attacks on infrastructure. The only one question I got in relation to another of those possibilities, the revival of a mini Cold War after a change of regime and attitude in Moscow. I wonder, why do you not make a reference to China as well?
Well, China, I have a feeling, China comes in under cyber. The Chinese are absolutely terrific at cyber, and that's the way they'll do it if they want to do it. They could do. They have done it several times a week. They attack the Cabinet Office and the Foreign Office, cyber. I don't know if that's known about, but I think it's to be the case. China is a very cautious country, and also is very fragile. When you look at again, there's always a problem. We like to scare ourselves witless with the rise of this or that or the other. And when you look at the problems of China, because of the one-child policy, think how few there are going to be, a lot of people, but the number of aged to look after. Also, that regime, there's endless disturbances which very rarely get into the press right across China. Once that regime crumbles, it's going to be extremely hard to hold the line. And it's very hard to move from a tyranny, albeit economically successful, buying off dissent, to anything approaching an open society without it all unravelling very fast. So to extrapolate from where we now are and call it the future, which is what most horizon scanners do, is absurd. Do you remember Japan scared us witless for 3 decades, and then it had its decade of stagnation? And people say, China's going through Africa, taking out its resources, putting its own people in, and that's what we did for a long time. Yeah. Any country that tries to overdo it in Africa, it's only a matter of time. Look what it did to us and the French. I mean, I'm slightly overdoing it here. China, of course, is an enormous force, but I don't think it's in the slightest bit likely to do what a revived Russia could do in terms of difficulty. And Russia's upgrading every nuclear power in the world at the moment is upgrading its nuclear weapon system. Russia is upgrading all 3 bits, land, sea and air. And its Akula submarines still come down, very advanced, thanks to the technology they stole, or the Walker Spiring stole from the United States. In the Soviet Embassy and Trade Mission, and maybe 1 or 2 here tonight of you, there are 35 intelligence officers, which is exactly the same number as there were in 1985, when the Cold War was still raging. Huge effort, intelligence effort, the Soviet Union, mainly scientific and technical. And capabilities are still very powerful there. They're rebuilding the new submarine force and all that.
I don't think they would ever get back to where the Cold War was, but intentions can change in 5 minutes. In August 1991, British intelligence knew, well, didn't know, for 3 days they didn't know who in Russia had the nuclear button. And so I don't want to keep alarming, I don't want to sound completely alarmist, but when you think, there's always a danger of thinking, right, we sorted that one, it's gone forever. It never has. And the Russians, for understandable reasons, are now reasserting themselves. They've got mineral and oil wealth, and the humiliations they suffered in the early 1990s are still very vivid for them. And it doesn't mean to say it's going to be a revival of the Cold War in the form in which we knew it for so long, 40 years. But there's and also the oil and gas weapon you can use very easily. One Russian boot across the line between East Germany and West Germany risked World War III. Turning off a gas tap doesn't, does it? For repairs, you know, we're just doing repairs. So the instruments they've got now are much more usable than that enormous accumulation of forces they had in the Cold War. In terms of troop capacity, this doesn't look here, this list, and I think reasonably, doesn't look as if state-to-state wars are going to be likely in the future. But in terms of highly qualified skills, you've got to keep them in being. You can't say we'll knit together fast jets if somebody starts menacing our air defence. In fact, it's for those of us of a certain age, it's very nostalgic. The Russian Tupolevs, the Bear bombers, are still coming down off Stornoway, and the Typhoons are scrambled from Lucas and got and waggle their wings and wave and all the usual stuff at regular intervals. If you go to Lucas, the RAF, every time they've headed one of these off, they get a little red bear with a red star to put on their uniform. It's just like the old days, Fred. Nice bit of nostalgia for us all. Not that the bears are going to start World War III, but they're testing out our air defences all the time. And if there's anybody here from the Soviet Embassy or Trade Mission, it's very nice to see you.
I would have to point out, if they're from the Soviet Trade Mission, they must be long since retired. I assume they're from the Commonwealth of Independent States. We have another question.
Thank you very much.
I'm just wondering what you think about the mismanagement of the small wars of Iraq and Afghanistan, and whether the generals were as much to blame as Frank Ledwidge thinks, and whether this indicates a future for our military.
I have a lot of sympathy for the military over Iraq because the Prime Minister didn't tell more than a handful of people in Whitehall in late April, early May 2002 what he'd agreed with President Bush at Crawford, and kept telling the House of Commons that it wasn't his intention to do anything by way of war in Iraq. They couldn't get the kit procured they needed. They couldn't operate in terms of getting ready. And you can't, they were forbidden to. And indeed, many of them were not brought in the picture. I know who I blame. One of those people that thinks in certain circumstances we have to intervene, but to do it without the United Nations Security Council specific resolution is dreadful. And also, Hans Blix and the inspector said we need more time. They didn't get more time. It's the most no end of a lesson. The Chilcot inquiry is going to be devastating. It's already had its effect because David Cameron, to his credit, got a specific UN resolution on Libya, and he published the Attorney General's opinion in full, properly, on the legality of the war as they saw it. So, for fear of being Chilcotted, all future Prime Ministers will actually go more carefully on due process. I like to think that we're one of the great due process nations in the world, but the road to Iraq showed that we most certainly were not. No end of a lesson. Dreadful.
But there seems to be a great gap in understanding of that part of the world, which I don't know if that was up to the military to understand it, but according to something of what Frank Ledwidge says, the Americans were doing a lot better than we were.
I'm not sure that's true.
Yeah.
The military, the British military, know a lot about where sand meets oil. A lot. And so do the intelligence people. And if you read the Butler report on Iraq and WMD, the Cabinet Office Secretariat prepared many extraordinarily good papers on post-invasion and so on. They were not circulated. Collective cabinet government completely broke down. That's another one of the most appalling things. We did have people who knew about that part of the world. And they were not listened to. Some of the best experts on politico-military affairs that Whitehall had were not listened to because they knew what they were going to say. Just as Anthony Eden ignored the leading Arabists in the Foreign Office.
Yeah.
Do you remember all that derision that Number 10 put out about the Camel Corps? When the former ambassadors to Middle Eastern countries wrote letters to the Times?
Yes.
Dreadful. Dreadful. You've touched a raw nerve there.
Thank you.
As you can see.
Well, not so much a raw nerve on my part, but an interesting one. Some of you know I have an interest in languages, which I dabble in occasionally. And very pleased to see that the government has realised the importance of language training and also an understanding of the countries where those languages are spoken.
William Hague said that in this great speech.
Yes, yes. And the cutting back of the language service and, of course, the cutting back of strategic embassies was one of the things, I think, which caused enormous damage to our position in that part of the world.
William was brilliant in this speech because he did his Northern Music Hall routine, you see.
He's got one.
And he said, oh yeah, he said, New Labour stripped out many, many of our great assets. For example, the wonderful Foreign Office Library. If you go in there now, you see empty shelves. And on one shelf, all on his own, is a stuffed anaconda called Albert in a glass cage. Absolutely wonderful he was.
Well, we liked Albert.
Albert and the lion, Albert the anaconda. Another question, sorry.
Thank you very much for the...
Thank you.
Just here. Thank you very much for the lecture. I was going to ask, to what extent do you put the inadequacy of the SDSR and also the government's reluctance to engage in grand strategy down to coalition politics? And secondly, if I may, you touched on the GDP and the defence budget being insufficient at 2%. Just wondering your thoughts on wider security expenditure on intelligence and policing and cuts in that area. Is that also sufficient currently?
Yes,
Thank
very
you.
good question. Coalition makes it more difficult. It's just that they're pretty unformed, this lot, because they hadn't been in government, you see, before. They've learnt very quickly, as ministers do. But there are tensions because of the coalition, because the Lib Dems aren't Trident replacement people by instinct. Just to cheer you up, I came up with a cunning plan, which I've not put to them yet because they might get upset, to make the bomb more palatable to the Lib Dems. And you'd have to do it secretly, of course. The rest of the world wouldn't be told. You need to associate the warhead with something Lib Dems tend to like. Now, plutonium is a tricky thing and expensive. Why do we put in the front end but not tell anybody? Nut cutlet. It would appeal to the herbivores in the Lib Dem parties immensely. But we'd have to keep it secret from the rest of the world. No, seriously, though, there are tensions. But it's quite right that the coalition should test out the cost of Trident and alternatives to it. I'm all in favour of that. That's what an open society should do. But the National Security Council works extremely well. And Nick Clegg is the deputy chairman of it. He chairs it when the Prime Minister's not there. And Chris Hoon's on it, and other Lib Dems. And it's got quite a rhythm. The subgroup on Libya met 61 times since the Libyan episode began. It's extraordinary. It meets every Tuesday after Cabinet, and it has proper papers and proper agendas, which is, again, a restoration of Cabinet government. But, of course, there are tensions. I think the intelligence budget in a world, even if you accept only part of this on this diagram, you mustn't skimp on intelligence, because it's, to use a terrible jargon, a force multiplier. Also, we're very good at it. And the relationship with the United States, based on an agreement which has now been declassified, the 1946 Communications Agreement, means that we're one of only 3 countries with global intelligence reach, the other being Russia and the United States. And this matters. And I think the cuts haven't been as drastic in the agencies, the intelligence agencies, as they have in some of the civil departments. But this really isn't the moment to be scaling back there. And also, I'm afraid that the threat that we face from domestic and international terrorism, which in many ways are now inseparable, means that you've got to keep on the qui-vive there as well. I mean, it's the first duty of the state to try and protect its people and the realm. So I'm not a cutter in any of those. But I think the British do bring certain special gifts in intelligence to the table, not least is the procedural one, which broke down, I'm afraid, if you believe the Butler report, and I suspect Chilcot, on the road to the war in Iraq, that out of the experience of World War II and the Joint Intelligence Committee, which is at the apex of the system, came the tradition, which other countries have not followed, that you always separate the providers of the intelligence picture from those who are going to decide what to do on the basis of it, so that the intelligence providers speak truth unto power, spare them nothing, give them pictures of reality, without becoming advocates. And the United States, there's much higher levels of advocacy than there is here, and for all the great Russian intelligence effort against us, there was a great tradition in the Cold War of serving it up to fit the existing prejudices of the number one customers in the Politburo. And of course it meant it was pointless a lot of the time doing that. And our tradition, which is another reason why it's so important that we keep Crown services, both military, civilian, civil service, diplomatic, who are there on the basis of ability, not because of their political sympathies. That we don't have a politicised Crown service. We have special advisors as sort of hybrids, who sometimes are good or sometimes dreadful. But our Crown service is a pearl beyond price. And if ever ministers began to surround themselves with people who told them what they wanted to hear rather than what they needed to know, we've lost it. I'm preaching again. I didn't mean to do that.
Good point, good point. Preach on, it's your lecture. Time for another question. Sir, there's one down here, sir.
Thank you. On your circle, around your circle, there are many threats that may or may not happen.
Yeah.
At the risk of depressing us further, though, would you like to comment on the fact that there is an increasing world population and an increasing use of resources, an increasing shortage of resources?
Yeah.
And that's actually going to happen rather than may happen.
One of the two of those reflect that, which is the unanticipated mass migration if there's a starvation or a disappearance of water. It's going to be very, very precarious, that. Mind you, every generation has had the Malthusian anxiety, and so far, it's just me making it.
I think it's a museum.
Oh, is it?
Yes. Or it might be the Chinese listening to you, actually.
Bloody cyber again. The Malthusian anxiety has always been with us, and miraculously, because of the amazing technological advances of the last 2 and a bit centuries, we've just kept ahead of it. But there's no guarantee that we will. And as Fred Jarvis was saying a moment ago, even in an advanced country like this, it's extremely hard to find work for our young people. Now that 43% of the age group, for example, go to university, extremely hard. I mean, when I went in the mid-60s, it was 7.5% of the age group that went. And it's a great thing that higher education has spread. It's just that the range of job opportunities that graduates will find interesting and stretching will never, ever fit. I mean, the last time, I think, if I remember the statistics, you could come out of graduating and get a job and sometimes have a pretty good choice was 1971, 2 years after I graduated. And ever since then, there's been the problem with that. And it's huge this year, for obvious reasons. And also, if the world economy manages just to bump along as it is at the moment, which will be quite cheering compared to what we might be facing in the next 2 or 3 days, it's going to be extremely hard for the world economy to get back to the growth levels that we come to accept as normal in the 1990s. Of course, looking around at the age group of some of you, we never fell for the view that boom and slump was over forever, that it had been cracked. Because, I mean, we have the great economic historian Roderick with us. I mean, the gods of economic history are wrathful bastards. They just wait. It's only a matter of time. And when anybody comes up with a hubristic remark like poor old Gordon did, they're asking for it. They're asking for it. I have great sympathy for the economists, really, because the reading of the runes and the horizon scanning that they're required to do, people load an enormous amount of emotional baggage onto it. And there's never enough scepticism. And it's very prone to kind of guru interpretation. It's almost a sort of surrogate for the religion that so many people seem to have lost in this country. And it always ends in tears. Always ends in tears, which is why I think the end of Keynes's general theory about madmen in authority hearing voices in the air, distilling their frenzy, should be emblazoned on the front of every economic analysis from every bank and every think tank, because that's absolutely true. But economic history is different because Roderick's like the famous old definition of an auditor who goes onto the battlefield and shoots the wounded. I mean, when you go back, as economic historians do, you're a kind of taxidermist, aren't you, really? But slightly more tactfully. And I'm all for economic history. In fact, I'm worried about it hasn't got its place in the British university system that it should have.
It really is quite worrying. We're not producing them in the way that we did in Roderick's generation, in terms of numbers, certainly. And I do worry about that, because we really do need economic historians now. Absolutely we need them. And of course one of the problems, I'm getting a bit nitty-gritty now, is that not Roderick, but some of them have collapsed into numbers. They've forgotten the magic. Keynes's description of the master economist, he was pretending to describe Alfred Marshall, but he was describing himself. And it was something like a person who can capture in the same sleight of thought the abstract and the concrete, who can see in symbols and think in words. It goes on. It's the most wonderful description of the polymath, Keynes. And we aren't doing that anymore. It's partly because of the hyper-specialisation and the PhD drills that we all go through. Because this is an era when we need synthesizers, not gurus, not quacks, but synthesizers. And I'm not sure my trade, the academic world, is producing them in the way that we used to, which is a great pity. And I was trying to think of something to cheer you up with. Keep going. I really must cheer you up.
Well, I'm afraid time is against us, so it would be too bad if you were to go away from a Gresham lecture feeling depressed. So since William Le Quex was mentioned, I thought we really must touch on P.G. Wodehouse, yes, who in Clarence Saves the Day of 1909 has England invaded simultaneously by no fewer than 9 foreign armies, each of which is unaware of the presence of the other. And it's only when an Austrian cavalryman canters across Lords and gets in the way of the bowler that people realise that the country is being invaded. I was hoping to link this to a serious question about asymmetric warfare, because in fact P.G. Wodehouse is the first person to use the phrase a mad mullah, one of whom in fact is invading the country at the time, and that was 1909. Yes, it's rather a nice one.
Clarence saved the day.
Clarence saved the day, indeed. But yes, I'm afraid we are very strict to Gresham about our starting and finishing times. To remind you, this is the Peter Naylor lecture, a man who, with David Vermont and the late George Webb, revived the fortunes of the college, very much due to them that the room is as full as it is this evening, and thanks, of course, to our emeritus professors who have kept us interested, amused and depressed over the years. I notice, in fact, that one of Peter's recent publications was called Preparing for the Worst, but I think this evening we've actually had a great deal of the very best. Thank you very much indeed.